Hello, this is Eric, and I'm going to be updating the file upload code today because we're getting these excessive errors in our incident reporting for JSON parse issues. I know why this is happening, and it's going to take a bit of work to refactor the code for file uploads in order to fix this issue. One good thing is that this error only affects invalid requests, so something that wouldn't have worked anyway, but we're not returning a useful error message in those cases. In fact, I suspect right now we're just hanging and never responding to the request. And also, in a batch operation, it's possible some of the file system operations may complete while others are invalid. And I don't think that's an ideal case. I think if the request itself is invalid, then they should all fail rather than have the batch request partly succeed. The issue is happening in these calls to JSON parse, and when we have invalid JSON, the error isn't being handled. In most places in Pewter's backend, we don't have this issue. This is because we have higher level error handlers that catch anything that aren't caught in more specific cases and return the correct error to the user, usually an instance of the API error class. However, in this case, we're using the busboy module in order to read all of the fields and file streams from a file upload request. The file upload logic is a little bit tricky because we want to avoid buffering files in memory or intermediate writes to disk, and ideally just pass them through onto the file system operation itself so that it can stream to whatever the storage mechanism is. For this reason, everything in an upload request has to be in a particular order. We start with metadata for the batch request, and that gives us information like the socket ID to send updates to as the request is progressing. Then we start sending information about files and operations that will happen during the request. So all of these can happen in any order, but the important thing is that they are not files. We need the information about files and the respective operations that are using the files before we start processing the file, because what we're going to do is hold on to that operation metadata and only start running that operation once we've started streaming the file. We do this by maintaining a couple of lists as we go through the request. One is a list of pending file system operations, ones which require a file, and one is a list of promises, and this list will be in the same order as operations in the request. I'm going to go through this now and pretend to be the file upload logic. We start off with a makedir operation spec. We don't need a file for the makedir operation spec, so we're going to start the operation immediately and create a makedir operation. And I'll just draw an arrow to note where that came from. Then we have a write operation spec. So we're going to take this write operation spec and we're going to put it in pend operations because we can't start the write until we have a file. Again, another makedir operation spec. So this again gets immediately invoked and goes into operation promises. And I'm going to try to make these arrows consistent. Next, we'll have another write operation spec. And just like before, this is going to go in pending operations and will not be executed right away. Now we have some file information. This actually goes in another list, and this list is called file infos. Here's file A information in file infos, and now file B information also gets put in this list. And now we get to the file contents. Each file contents is going to map to a file information object in the same order. These file information objects contain the size of the file as well as the MIME type, and we need both of those pieces of information while we're processing the file. Now we go to file contents. For each file contents we receive, we find the appropriate file information and then associate it with an operation spec. Then we invoke the operation and the file will begin streaming. If the operation contains a small file, we might end up processing multiple file contents at the same time and be able to invoke the operations in parallel. Whereas if there are a few large files, then we're going to wait some time until we reach the correct point in the request stream where file B content starts before we start actually executing the next operation. And that's part of why file upload on Pewter is so fast. And for completion's sake, I'm going to add the final write operation, which is going to be file B contents as well as file B information. And I'm forgetting a couple of important arrows here. This is starting to look a bit messy, but I would like this to be complete. We have the, write operation specs that define the write operation. We're still holding on to those, and we use those to determine all of the arguments that are going into that write operation when using the batch API. I moved the arrows around a little bit in an attempt to make it a bit more clear. I'm not done doing that yet. Let's call that a work in progress. But I did remember something important that I forgot to mention, which is that when we're going through these operation specs, if we get to an operation that we can't invoke right away, which we put in pending operations because it depends on a file, we also put a null in operation promises. And the reason that we put this null here is so that we can return all the results in the correct order. So a more accurate rendition of this diagram actually would show that we had a null and we eventually put a write operation kind of on top of it where the null used to be. And in the same case over here, this write operation goes on top of a former null. To front. So this would be a more accurate representation of what happens in the batch request. Here is where the major changes come into play. I don't want to invoke any of these operations until the stream has reached this point in the request. This red line here. If we put all of the operations in pending operations during the first part, then as soon as we get to this line, we should be able to perform the same logic that we currently do while processing the first part of the request, invoking the operations that we can that don't require a file immediately, such as these makedir operations, and then only moving the write operation specs to actual write operations when we reach their respective files. This will allow us to check the operation specs all for errors first. For example, if JSON parse throws an exception, and then if any of the operation specs have an error, then we can cancel the entire request instead of doing something partially complete. These things are typically easier said than done, so let's give it a whirl. I'm going to start with modifying this code here. This is when we get an operation, and this is where we check if the operation requires a file and put it in pending operations. So what I want to do is put all operations in pending operations every time. And for now I'm just commenting stuff out because I feel like I may need to reference it later. We'll clean this up at the end when I make a commit. Everything is in pending operations now, which means the rest of the code should be broken. Every time we hit a file, we're going to check pending operations, and then we're going to try to attach files to make their operations, and that's not going to work at all. I think there's usually value in running code that's known to be broken to see what the error case is and if it's what you expect. I'm going to upload this directory, which contains a directory containing a file, as well as two other files, and I'm going to see what error I get. What I'm expecting is it's going to say there aren't enough files in the request because it's trying to associate a file to each of these operations. So let's give that a whirl. It looks like what happens is the batch request hangs. It's stuck in a pending state, and the server never resolves that. So we actually aren't able to give an error response in this case in the specific way that I just broke the code right now. I have a pretty good idea now why the request gets stuck in pending. It's because when we start the makedir operation, we're not consuming the file. We can see it outputs this console log got a file. That happens down here whenever we get a file from the busboy module. And we never get a second file. And that's just happening because we're not reading the stream. So the stream isn't continuing to be consumed. So we never actually get the next file. And if we did get the next file, it would actually run the next operation, which I believe is another makedir operation. We can see in here we have a makedir operation and then a second makedir operation after that. So that's why it gets stuck in pending state. That makes a lot of sense. So we're not going to see this issue, this error handling issue come up in if we're actually processing the request properly. What we need to do now is update this code so when we get the first file in the stream, that's when we know that we've already processed every part of the request that's not a file, that might be an operation spec. We take all the operation specs that can be run without a file out of pending operations and then actually execute them. And at the same time, we'll end up executing the first operation that requires a file as well, because we just got the beginning of that file stream. I think we don't need to change any of the logic for that first file. It just shifts something from pending operations, and conveniently, we already call this method called onFirstFile when we get the first file at the beginning of this handler here. And if I'm not mistaken, all I need to do is go through all the pending operations and move this check that I commented out, operation requires file, to there and execute them in this onFirstFile function right here. Now the onFirstFile function is updated. What we do is create a list of indices to remove, iterate over all the pending operations, and if the operation does not require a file, record that index as an index to remove, and then execute the operation right away. This is the same code that I commented out down here when we were running the operations as we process the request. And then we just iterate over the indices to remove and get rid of them all. And we can give that a try. It looks like that works. And it looks like the contents of all our files are there, and all of the files are there as well. So that's a pretty good sign. Now none of the file system operations are invoked before the position in the request where I put this red line. That means in the first portion of the request, it's acceptable to throw an error and abort the entire batch operation, and it will never end up being partly complete if there's an actual syntax problem with one of the operations. It's important to note the operations still can fail later on in the request, but that's acceptable. The batch endpoint will return a list of response objects for each operation, and if one of them failed, then that position in the response object will contain an error message. For that case, that's the best we can do because we won't really know if that part of a file system operation is going to fail until we actually try to run it. For error handling within this callback on the busboy module, this happens on the field event, I decided to look online and see if there's any specific information about that, because handling errors that happen in callbacks, especially with various modules, um, there's nuances between different ones. So I can't make any assumptions. I found the Stack Overflow answer that describes the approach that I'd like to use, where we create a wrapper function to handle the error. And when they abort the request, they call request.unpipe busboy. That, I believe, is to stop processing the stream from the request, which is important because that would be wasted bandwidth for a request that we're not actually going to do anything with. And then we close the connection. First, I'm going to add a state variable here called request error, and that's just going to start off as null. And I talked about using a wrapper function in the previous clip. In the Stack Overflow example, they're using a work queue and adding this asynchronous function and during try catch. Presumably there might be more than one thing you might wrap with abort with error. In our case, this is only happening on the field event, and I'm actually just going to wrap it in a big try catch. That's not my favorite thing to do, but in this case, it's the most practical thing to do. And if we get any of these errors, we're just going to set request error. And then we're going to close the busboy stream. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I don't know if I'm going to use the same status code though. What is HTTP 413? Content too large. So that's not the appropriate response here. In this case, it's going to be 400. And I'm going to send a better response for that later. Right now, I just want to see if it actually works. Once we do that, presumably busboy.onClose, the callback to that is going to be called. I'm not 100% sure about that, so I'll have to check. And then it's going to resolve this still reading promise. This is an instance of a utility class that I made called tPromise, which is defined over here. So it extends promise, and when we call resolve, it resolves. Simple as that. So once we are no longer still reading the request, that's when we can check if there's a request error. And if there's a request error, we already responded. I might actually move the request response in here. I think it'll be easier to find it there since it's closer to our other response. For now, I'm just gonna again see if it works. We'll give this a try. In this case, actually, I need a different test payload in order to test the error because this one's just gonna work fine. I think the easiest way to test error handling on the batch endpoint is going to be using fetch manually in the console. This right here is a valid request. So once I run it, I'm going to get a text file and then a directory. The format of the request has the operations, a file info object, and we append a blob to the end of the request. Now I'm going to make this JSON input invalid. I'm going to try the operation first and then file info. So let's add an angled bracket to the beginning of this JSON string. And what I'm expecting to happen is I will get an error message and neither a directory nor a file will be created. So I'm going to delete the ones that I created last time. run this and we'll see what happens. I get 400 bad request. If I refresh the desktop, I don't see anything. And if I look in the network tab, we can see our response from batch. So that seems to be working as expected, which is great news. Now I need to try the other case. We're going to add an invalid JSON string to the file info. And the same thing should happen. But the same thing did not happen. We actually got a directory. So that I need to investigate. We are getting an error in the console here. I just added a console log in the try catch. So it is catching the error. What's happening is we are continuing with the request anyway, which is not what I expected. I added console logs before and after the still reading promise. I'm thinking maybe the request error is somehow set after still reading resolves. Whoops. And let's look through the log and see if that's what happens. I was able to find the log that says await still reading, but I was not able to find the log that says it's resolved. I think what's happening is this isn't getting resolved, which might be because the callback on busboy.onClose doesn't get called when we do what we do in our error handling here. Also, because this operation, or rather this file info, is immediately before the file in the request stream, we actually continue processing the request stream even after this point, and we end up calling the callback for busboy.onFile, which then is going to call onFirstFile. And onFirstFile itself, wherever that is, here it is, does not check if we have a request error. So this may be a better place to check for the request error. Okay, let's give this a try. So I still get the bad request error, and it looks like a directory is not created. So that's great news. That means that worked. For good measure, I'm going to test my valid request again and make sure that that still works. And that appears to work as intended. And I'm also going to test the other error case again, where we had an angle bracket in the operation spec instead of in the file info. And in that case, we still get the expected result. So there we have it. Better error handling, or more preemptive error handling for batch upload requests on Pewter. And now we can check that off. I'd like to close this one off by thanking all of the contributors to the Pewter repository. There are 39 contributors at this moment, and every little bit makes Pewter that much better. We've already received a lot of incredibly helpful PRs that make Pewter more useful and also more fun to use. This is a massive repository, and we also understand that there's a lot of time spent not just writing the code and implementing new features, but also reading the code that's there and understanding what was developed before you started making a contribution to it. So that is really fantastic, and we've seen some high quality pull requests and all that. So again, thanks to everyone for making this a possibility.